The chipped formica of the diner counter was cold under my elbows. I'd had black coffee and a slice of apple pie, even though I knew I shouldn't. It was a Tuesday, and Tuesdays were for leftovers, for stretching things. But Ray, the waitress, she'd given me an extra-large slice, said it looked like I needed it. She'd been working there for a long time and had a way of looking right through you. It felt indulgent, sitting there, letting someone else worry about things for a minute, easier than facing the kitchen and the stack of bills Lena was meticulously organizing on the table. Easier than the quiet disappointment in her eyes. It was 7:55, time to go. The switching station was not what I expected. The pictures online, the job listing, made it look almost industrial romantic, like something out of a Hopper painting. It wasn't. It was just gray. Gray concrete, gray sky, gray metal. The building itself was long and low, a corrugated steel box squatting beside the tracks. It smelled like diesel and something else, something older, like wet stone and dust. Not unpleasant, just heavy. I unlocked the door with the key they'd mailed me. The metal cold and slick in my hand. The air inside was colder and smelled even more strongly of that damp stone. The main room was dominated by the control panel, a sprawling console covered in switches, buttons, and blinking lights. A faded map of the rail lines covered one wall, crisscrossed with handwritten notes in what looked like a dozen different inks. There were a couple of hard plastic chairs, a small desk cluttered with logbooks and clipboards, and a microwave in the corner, next to a cooler. Over everything hung the low hum of the electrical system, punctuated by the distant rumble of trains. It wasn't loud, just present. I checked the logbook. Quiet night, apparently. Just a few scheduled freight runs. I started going through the pre-shift checklist, testing the signals, verifying the track switches. Standard stuff. That's when I found it. I was looking for a pen, rummaging through the bottom drawer of the desk, when my hand bumped against a manila folder taped to the inside of the cabinet. It wasn't hidden exactly, but it wasn't out in the open either, just tucked away. I pulled it out. It was full of typed and handwritten notes, stapled together. Station Operating Procedures Confidential was scrawled across the front in black marker. The first rule read, if the occupancy counter shows more people in the building than are signed in, do not take a head count yourself. Note the discrepancy and contact the supervisor. I frowned. An occupancy counter? I hadn't even noticed one. I looked around. Above the door, next to the clock, was a small digital display. It read 1. I hadn't signed in yet. Odd. The next one. Do not bring any items that are yellow onto the premises. This includes clothing, accessories, food packaging, or personal items. That was specific. Lena had packed me a banana. I'd left it in my lunch bag. I chuckled, shaking my head. Apparently, previous employees had a thing about yellow. Or maybe it was a joke. At exactly 1:17 a.m., perform 3 full rotations in your chair for exactly 7 seconds. Do not skip it. Okay, definitely weird. I pictured old man Hemmings, the dispatcher at the last yard I worked, writing something like this. He was a prankster. This had to be something like that. Do not sign your full legal name on any document that will remain on the premises overnight. Use initials or a work designation. That seemed unnecessarily paranoid. The list went on. If someone scheduled for pickup, delivery, or appointment doesn't arrive within 15 minutes, log the no-show and move on. Do not call to follow up. If a coworker asks to swap shifts with you for a specific date, ask why before agreeing. If they cannot or will not explain, do not swap. Before turning any corner in the south hallway, knock twice on the wall and wait 3 seconds before proceeding. Never count aloud on the premises. All counting, inventory, rooms, people, must be done silently. It was a long list, full of these strange, arbitrary rules. I read it all, skimming really, more amused than anything. Some bored employee had clearly gone a little stir-crazy. I tossed the folder back into the drawer, figuring I'd ignore most of it. It wasn't like anyone was going to check. It wasn't like anything bad was going to happen. I signed the visitor log, making sure to scribble just K. Davies at the bottom. The occupancy counter now read 2. I settled into the chair, started running through the pre-shift diagnostics again. The hum of the electrical system seemed louder now, or maybe I was just paying more attention. I glanced at the clock, 8:03 p.m. A long night ahead. I reached for the controls and noticed a faint scent, something new. Not diesel, not wet stone, something like burnt sugar. It was barely there, a fleeting sweetness, but it was definitely different. I dismissed it as a trick of the ventilation, probably just coming from the diner. I was logging train car numbers into the system, a tedious task that mostly involved squinting at faded paint and trying to decipher the operator's handwriting from the previous shift. Car 47B221, Car 47B228, Car 47B235, each one needed to be entered cross-referenced with the manifest and flagged for its destination. It was mind-numbing, but it paid the bills. At least it was supposed to. The bills felt like they were multiplying. Fran was still recovering, and the physical therapy wasn't covered. Every session felt like another brick in a wall of debt. The coffee was lukewarm. Even after I'd microwaved it, it tasted metallic, like the machine hadn't been cleaned in a month. I took a sip anyway. Needed the caffeine. I'd started listening to old episodes of Coast to Coast AM to keep myself awake. Art Bell's voice, crackling through the static, felt companionable in a strange way, like someone else was keeping watch with me in this empty place. Tonight it was a rebroadcast from 1998, something about cattle mutilations in Montana. I glanced up at the occupancy counter. It read 3. That was right. Me, Vince, who'd stopped by to drop off the manifest around 7:30, and Mort, the security guard who did a quick walkthrough every couple of hours. I hadn't seen Mort since he came in to check the perimeter. I hadn't signed him in, of course. He was security. He didn't need signing in. A few minutes later, I looked up again, mostly because my eyes were starting to blur from staring at the screen. The counter now displayed 4. That was odd. I hadn't seen anyone. Vince had left ages ago, and Mort should still be making his rounds. Maybe the counter was malfunctioning. They were old digital displays, prone to glitches. I looked around the room, slowly, deliberately. The flickering fluorescent lights cast long shadows, making the empty corners seem deeper, more substantial. Nothing, just the rows of inactive control panels, the stacks of paperwork, the industrial-sized coffee maker. I frowned, then glanced back at the counter. Still, 4. Then I remembered the document, the operating procedures, that ridiculous list of rules. Something about the occupancy counter. I racked my brain, trying to recall the exact wording. Something about discrepancies, not taking a head count, just contacting the supervisor. It felt absurd. I was going to call Greta, my supervisor, about a potentially faulty digital display. She'd think I was losing it, but the rule, it was stuck in my head now, a nagging little voice. Don't take a head count. It wasn't worth risking whatever bizarre consequence that rule was trying to prevent, even if it meant looking foolish. I picked up the phone, dialed Greta's extension. It rang 5 times before she answered, her voice groggy. Greta speaking. Hey, it's Kieran. Just calling about the occupancy counter. It's showing 4 people in the building, but I only account for 3. There was a pause. 4? That's unusual. Have you checked all the rooms? Bathrooms? Break room? Storage? No, ma'am. The procedure, the document, it said not to do a head count myself if there's a discrepancy. Just to report it. Greta sighed, a long, weary sound. Right, that old thing. Look, just wait there. I'll radio Mort and have him check in. Probably just a glitch like you said. Don't worry about it. I hung up the phone, feeling a little ridiculous. I went back to logging car numbers, trying to focus. Car 47B242, Car 47B249. A minute later, the radio crackled to life. Greta's voice, clipped and professional. Mort, report to the switching station. We have a discrepancy on the occupancy counter. Static. Then, Mort's voice, clear and steady. Copy that, Greta. On my way. I waited and waited. 5 minutes passed. 10. Still no sign of Mort. I looked up at the counter. It hadn't changed. Still 4. Then I saw it. In the reflection of the darkened window opposite my desk. A shape standing in the doorway of the south hallway, It wasn't Mort. It wasn't anyone I recognized. It was tall and thin. It didn't move, just stood there, partially obscured by the shadows. I blinked. When I looked again, it was gone. I told myself it was fatigue, the lack of sleep, the flickering lights playing tricks on my eyes, the stress about Fran's medical bills. It had to be. But the image lingered, a dark smudge on the edge of my vision. I reached for my coffee, but my hand wouldn't stop. It hovered over the mug, then clenched into a fist. The metallic taste was still there, coating my tongue. I needed air. I stood up, and for the first time that night, the burnt sugar smell was strong. I sat back down, trying to regulate my breathing. It was stupid to get rattled by a shadow. Just a shadow. This place played tricks on you. The silence was the worst part. Not a complete silence, exactly. The low hum of the electricity and the distant rumble of a train on a different line were present, but it was empty, lifeless. Like all the sound had been sucked out of the world. I forced myself to focus on the car logs, 47B, 255, 262. I needed to finish this batch. Then I could check the security cameras, just to be sure. Mort should have been here by now, though. It wasn't like him to be late. Greta would have called if something had happened. He was a retired state trooper, built like a brick wall. Not someone you'd expect to just disappear. I rubbed my eyes, feeling the grit of exhaustion. Maybe I should just call Greta again. Pretend I hadn't already. Just say I was double-checking. My hand reached for the phone, then paused. I glanced down at my coffee mug. It was a chipped ceramic thing, a gift from Fran a few years back. A bright, cheerful yellow. She'd gotten it at some craft fair, and I'd always thought it was a little too loud for my taste. But she liked it, and I used it every shift. It was familiar, comforting. And then I remembered something about the procedures. Something about colors. It wasn't a clear memory, more like a vague impression, a warning. Something about not bringing certain colors onto the premises. I couldn't recall the exact wording, but the feeling was there, a prickle of unease at the back of my neck. It felt important. Ridiculous. It was just a coffee mug, a yellow coffee mug. What possible harm could a coffee mug do? Greta had dismissed the whole document as some bored employee's overactive imagination. Probably this was the same thing. A pointless rule dreamed up by someone with too much time on their hands. I took a sip of coffee, trying to convince myself it was all nonsense. It tasted bitter. Not because of the coffee, but because of the sudden, insistent feeling that I'd made a mistake. But what if it wasn't? What if there was something to this? I didn't want to risk it. Not when Fran needed me. Not when everything was already so precarious. Better safe than sorry. It was a silly feeling, like being superstitious, but I couldn't shake it. I didn't have the energy to argue with myself. I quickly rinsed the mug, dried it with a paper towel, and stuffed it into my worn duffel bag, burying it under a spare pair of socks and a half-eaten bag of pretzels. It felt wrong, like hiding evidence of a crime I hadn't committed. But it was done. The yellow was out of sight. The silence seemed to deepen. The hum of the electricity felt louder. I went back to logging car numbers, my hand moving mechanically across the form. 47B269, 276. I glanced up at the occupancy counter. It still read 4. I tried to focus, but my attention kept drifting. I kept expecting to see something. A shadow, a movement, anything. Nothing. Just the empty hallway. The flickering lights. The relentless ticking of the wall clock. I found myself listening for Mort, straining to hear the sound of his boots on the concrete floor. Then, the radio crackled. Not Greta's voice, not Mort's, a different voice. Static-laced and distorted, but unmistakably human. It wasn't saying anything coherent, just a string of fragmented syllables and garbled sounds. It cut off abruptly, leaving only the hiss of static. I reached for the volume control, and my fingers slipped. I fumbled with it for a moment, then gave up. My hands felt cold, not from the temperature but from something else. A creeping numbness that started in my fingertips and spread up my arms. I looked down at my hands. They weren't trembling, exactly. They were still, frozen in place, and they felt heavier than they should. I pulled them back onto the desk, forcing myself to continue logging car numbers. 47B 285, 292. I glanced at the door to the south hallway again. It was still empty, but the air felt different, thicker, and the burnt sugar smell was back. Stronger this time, almost cloying. It hung in the air like a shroud. I kept logging the car numbers, forcing myself to concentrate on the sequence. The stencils, the weight of the pen in my hand. 47B 299, 303, 311. It was a mindless task, but it was something to occupy my brain, to push back against the feeling. The cold in my hands hadn't gone away, but it hadn't spread. It was just there, a dull ache in my fingertips. The coffee was long gone, cold and bitter at the bottom of the paper cup. I needed another one badly. I hadn't had a decent night's sleep in weeks, and the caffeine was the only thing keeping me from completely falling apart. But getting up meant walking back down that hallway past the door where I'd seen nothing, just the suggestion of something. I told myself it was the shadows, the flickering fluorescent lights playing tricks on my eyes, the exhaustion. I glanced at the clock. 2:53 a.m., still a long stretch until 6. I focused on the car numbers again, trying to ignore the creeping sensation that I was being watched. It wasn't a visual thing, not exactly. It was more like a pressure on the back of my neck, like someone was breathing down my spine. I rubbed the back of my neck with my left hand, the one that felt the most numb. Then I remembered something, the document, the ridiculous, unsettling document. There had been something about times, specific times for specific things. I couldn't recall the exact wording, just a vague impression of a schedule, a series of instructions that had to be followed precisely, and a warning. Something about what happened if you didn't. I dismissed it as the rambling of a lunatic. Probably a former employee who'd been fired and was trying to get revenge by scaring the current staff. It was a pathetic thought, really, but it was a comfortable one. But then the clock ticked over to 3 a.m., and the overhead speakers, which hadn't made a sound since I'd arrived, crackled to life. Not with a voice, not with music, just a single sustained tone, a low, resonant hum that vibrated through the floor and up into my chair. It wasn't loud, but it was insistent. It demanded attention. And I remembered the rule, or rather the hazy recollection of it. 3 a.m., a specific action, for a specific duration. I didn't remember what the action was, but the urgency of it was undeniable. A knot formed in my stomach. I felt a surge of panic, quickly followed by a wave of self-reproach. This was absurd. I was letting a silly document dictate my behavior. I scanned the room, searching for something. Anything that looked like it needed doing? Nothing. Just the control panels, the logging forms, the empty hallway. Then I saw it. A small metal lever on the side of the main control panel. It was labeled Track 4 Diverter. I didn't know what a Track 4 diverter did, but it was the only thing that seemed remotely relevant. The tone continued, unwavering. I hesitated for a moment, then reached for the lever. It felt cold and smooth under my fingers. I flipped it. The tone didn't stop. I held it. The humming persisted. I checked the clock. 1 minute, 2, 3. It felt pointless, ridiculous. I wanted to stop, to check on Mort, to call Greta, to do anything other than stand here flipping a random lever for an unknown amount of time. But the tone, it felt like a command, a directive. I held the lever for a full 5 minutes, my arm aching, my hand numb. The tone finally stopped, abruptly. Silence descended, heavier than before. I released the lever. Nothing happened. No lights flickered. No alarm sounded. No trains rumbled past. Just silence. I felt foolish and drained. I finally stood, intending to call Greta and ask if she knew what that was about. When I saw it, a small, crumpled note taped to the bottom of the monitor. I hadn't noticed it before. It was written in a shaky, unfamiliar hand. Lena, insulin, track 4, urgent. My heart clenched. Lena worked the day shift, and I remembered her mentioning something about diabetes. She kept her insulin in a small cooler in her locker, which was on track 4, and I had just diverted power to that track for 5 minutes. 5 minutes she wouldn't have access to her medication. I hadn't even thought to ask. I hadn't even considered anyone but myself. I spent 20 minutes filling out the incident report. Lena was furious. Understandably, Not yelling, but tight, like a spring coiled too tight. She'd been shaky and pale. She said she felt like she was staring into the sun. I'd explained about the tone, the lever, the complete and utter confusion. She hadn't really seemed to hear me. She just kept repeating how lucky she was that Mort had noticed her looking unwell and gotten her a juice box from the break room before things got really bad. Mort, of all people. He always hovered. The form itself was standard railroad boilerplate. It asked for date, time, location, description of incident, and corrective action taken. The last line was for signatures. Name, title, date. I grabbed the pen, a cheap plastic thing that always seemed to skip, and started to write. Kieran Bellwether. It felt formal, too formal for a mistake like this. I'd been thinking about Greta all night, about the bills, about how much worse things could get if I lost this job, and the weight of that, I guess, made me want to be official. To present a serious face to this whole mess. As the ink left the pen, I caught a flicker of movement in my peripheral vision. Down the hallway near the break room, just a shadow, really, but it was enough to make my hand hesitate. I glanced up, scanning the hallway. It was empty. Just the flickering fluorescent lights and the dust motes dancing in the air. I told myself it was fatigue. The lack of sleep was getting to me. I was seeing things. But even as I thought it, I felt a prickling sensation on my arms, the same one I'd gotten when I first read that document. A feeling like the air had suddenly become dense. And then I remembered. A fragment of the document. Something about signatures. Not just any signature. A complete name. It wasn't a warning. Not exactly. More like a caution, a statement of fact, something about granting access. Access to what I couldn't recall. But the image of the typed words swam into my mind. Full legal name, followed by a long, unbroken line of text I couldn't quite grasp. I stopped mid-signature. My hand hovered over the form, the pen poised in mid-air. It felt ridiculous, paranoid. I was letting a bizarre set of instructions dictate my behavior. This was a simple incident report, a minor administrative error. What difference could a signature possibly make? Just a name on a piece of paper. I glanced at the clock. It was 4:27 a.m., another 2 hours until my shift ended. Another 2 hours of this nonsense. The smell hit me then. Not a strong smell, but a subtle one. Like old paper and something else. Something metallic, but not like blood. More like rust, or maybe pennies. No, not pennies. Something older, something deeper. I sniffed again, trying to place it. The scent seemed to be coming from the form itself. From the ink, from the paper. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. It was enough. I slashed through Kieran Bellwether with a thick, angry line. The pen skipped, leaving a jagged, uneven mark. I initialed instead. KB small, neat, insignificant. It felt better. Not good, but less wrong. Less exposed. Like I'd closed a door I hadn't even realized was open. I handed the form to Lena, avoiding her gaze. She took it without a word, her face still pale. She scanned the signature, then looked up at me, her eyes narrowed. "Just initials?" she asked, her voice flat. "Yeah," I said, trying to sound casual. Figured it was sufficient. Just a routine report, right? She didn't respond, just signed the form herself, her hand moving quickly and deliberately. She didn't make eye contact. After signing, she folded the report and tucked it into a manila envelope. Then, she did something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. She didn't file the envelope in the designated box. She walked down the hallway, toward the small, locked storage room I'd never been inside. The storage room that was always kept dark. She swiped a keycard, the lock clicked, and she disappeared inside, taking the report with her. I watched her go, a knot forming in my stomach. The smell lingered, faint but persistent. And the lingering weight of the occupancy counter, of the yellow mug, of the lever, pressed down on me. 3 things. 3 small violations, 3 concessions. I rubbed the back of my neck again, the numbness spreading. I needed to call Greta. I needed to tell her I was okay. I needed to convince myself that I was okay. But I didn't move. I just stood there, listening to the silence, waiting for something to happen. I spent the next hour meticulously cleaning the control panel. Not a deep clean, just wiping down the surfaces, straightening the wires, organizing the tools. It wasn't strictly part of my duties, but it was something to do. Something to occupy my hands, to keep the thoughts at bay. The metal of the panel was cold under my fingertips, slick with a film of dust and grease. It smelled faintly of ozone and something else. Old electrical wiring, maybe. Each click and whir of the relays felt amplified in the quiet of the station. I checked the logbook, made sure all the entries were legible, double-checked the timestamps. Small things, meaningless things. But they filled the time. The schedule for deliveries was surprisingly light tonight, mostly empty freight cars being shuffled between yards. One scheduled pickup, though, a small shipment of industrial lubricant, supposed to arrive around 6:15. The manifest listed the consignee as Mort's Automotive out in Oakhaven. I hadn't dealt with Mort before, but the name sounded familiar, a local business probably. I made a note of the car number, the siding it was expected on, and the estimated arrival time. The clock above the panel ticked steadily, each second a small hammer blow against the silence. Around 6, I started monitoring the radio chatter more closely, listening for confirmation from dispatch. Nothing. 6:15 passed, then 6:20. Still nothing. I checked the schedule again, just to be sure I hadn't missed something. Nope. 6:15 p.m., car 487, Mort's Automotive. I glanced at the occupancy counter, still reading 3. Lena hadn't returned from the storage room. It felt longer than it had been since she went in there. I tried to shake the feeling that I was forgetting something important. I remembered the document. Not the specific rules, but the overall tone, the directness. It wasn't a suggestion, it was an instruction, and suddenly a piece of it came back to me, not as words, but as a sensation. A feeling of finality, something about what to do when things didn't arrive. When appointments were missed, it hadn't been framed as a warning, more like a procedure, a matter of course. Log it and proceed. Do not inquire. I dismissed it immediately. It was ridiculous. I was overthinking things. Trains were late all the time. Weather, mechanical failures, track obstructions, a million reasons why a delivery might be delayed. I was just letting this whole situation get to me. It was the late hours, the stress about Greta's bills, the unsettling events of the night. It was all adding up. I told myself to relax, to focus on my job, to wait for further instructions. I reached for the logbook, my hand hovering over the blank page. But I didn't wait for instructions. My hand moved almost on its own, writing down the details of the missed pickup. Car 487, Mort's Automotive, scheduled for 6:15 p.m. No show. I entered the time, the date, the car number, the consignee. I didn't write a note, didn't add a question mark, didn't indicate any intention of following up. I just logged it, and then I moved on. I checked the status of the other freight cars, adjusted the signals for an incoming train from the north. I focused on the tasks at hand, forcing myself to concentrate on the mechanics of the job. Each lever pulled, each switch thrown, each signal light illuminated was a small act of defiance against the creeping unease. But even as I worked, a cold dread settled in my stomach, a sense of something unacknowledged. I didn't check for messages. I didn't ask dispatch for an update. I didn't even glance at the radio. I knew, somehow, that asking would be a mistake, that seeking information would only open a door I didn't want to open. The document, the feeling, it all pointed to a single, terrifying conclusion. Some questions are better left unanswered. The rest of the shift passed in a blur of routine tasks and silent tension. The occupancy counter remained at 3. Lena didn't reappear, and the empty space where car 487 should have been on the schedule felt wrong. Not just delayed, but absent. As my replacement, Vince, arrived, I handed over the logbook, pointed out the completed tasks, and deliberately avoided mentioning the missed pickup. I didn't want to draw attention to it. I didn't want to ask any questions. I just wanted to get out of there. As I walked to my car, the air felt thick and still. The smell of ozone seemed stronger now, clinging to my clothes, to my skin. I unlocked the car, started the engine, and drove away, leaving the station behind. Leaving the unanswered question hanging in the silence. Leaving Mort's Automotive and car 487 lost somewhere in the dark. I kept my hands tight on the wheel, focusing on the road ahead, and didn't look back. The rhythmic click of the switch points was hypnotic. I was running a diagnostic cycle on the Western Line, slowly working my way down the track, checking the alignment and functionality of each switch. It wasn't critical work, just preventative maintenance, but it gave me something to focus on, something tangible, something other than the empty space where Lena had been. The smell of oil and metal was strong in the small maintenance shed, a familiar, almost comforting scent. I wiped a smudge of grease from my forehead with the back of my hand, leaving a dark streak across my skin. The radio crackled to life, breaking the silence. It was Ray, calling in from the dispatch office. She sounded cheerful, too cheerful for 4 in the morning. "Kieran, just checking in. Is everything running smoothly out there?" "Yeah, Ray," I said, forcing a similar lightness into my voice. "Just doing some routine checks, all quiet." "Good, good. Listen, just a heads up. Greta called in sick. Bad migraine, apparently. She wants to know if you'd be willing to cover her shift on the 27th. The 27th. 3 weeks from now, a long time. The 27th, that's a while off." "I know, but she wanted to ask. She said it's a family thing, something she doesn't want to get into over the radio." I remembered the document, not the specific wording, but the feeling, a cold, hard feeling in my chest, something about accepting favors, about being asked for something specific, not just a general offer, something about why they were asking. It wasn't a clear memory, just an echo, a pressure behind my eyes. The gist of it was, don't accept without knowing. It was probably nothing. Greta was a nice woman, reliable. She probably genuinely had a family commitment. I was being paranoid, letting everything that had happened get to me. It was ridiculous to think a simple shift swap could be anything other than what it seemed. I was letting the empty feeling of the last shift, the missing Lena, poison any logical thought process. I needed to stop dwelling. "Yeah, sure," I said. "I can cover for her. Tell her not to worry." "Really? That's great, Kieran. She'll be so relieved. I'll let her know. Thanks a bunch." "No problem." I disconnected the radio and leaned back against the workbench, feeling a wave of exhaustion wash over me. I hadn't even asked why. That little voice, the one that had been nagging at me since I found the document, was quiet now. I'd done the right thing. Helping a coworker, being a team player, it was all perfectly normal. Except it wasn't. As I started repacking my tools, I glanced at the occupancy counter. Still reading 3. It hadn't changed since Lena disappeared. I made a mental note to ask Vince about it when he arrived. Maybe it was malfunctioning. Maybe it needed recalibrating. Then, I noticed something else. A faint discoloration on the floor, just beyond the reach of the overhead light. It was a small, circular stain, almost invisible against the concrete. I knelt down, squinting, trying to make out what it was. It wasn't oil or grease or any of the usual grime that accumulated in the shed. It was darker, almost black, and it smelled faintly of iron, not like rust, but older, like dried blood. I dismissed it instantly. Probably just a spill from something someone brought in. Someone's lunch, maybe, or a cleaning solution. It wasn't worth investigating. I was tired, stressed, and my imagination was running wild. I stood up, brushing dust off my knees. But as I stood, I noticed the stain wasn't just on the floor. It was also on the far wall, forming a perfect circle about waist high. The color was the same, a deep, unsettling black. And it was growing, slowly, imperceptibly, but growing nonetheless. I stared at it, my breath catching in my throat. It wasn't a spill, it wasn't a stain. It was spreading. Like ink in water, the smell of iron intensified, filling the small shed, making my nostrils burn. I felt a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, a coldness that had nothing to do with the temperature. Then, I noticed the pattern. The circular stain on the wall wasn't perfectly smooth. It had a texture. A subtle, almost imperceptible relief. As I moved closer, I realized what it was. It was a shape, an outline, a perfect impression of a human form. Not a silhouette, not a shadow, an impression, as if someone had been pressed against the wall, leaving their shape behind. And the shape, it wasn't Lena's. It was larger, broader, and the head was too small, disproportionately small for the body. I backed away slowly, my heart hammering against my ribs. I didn't understand what I was seeing. It defied explanation. It wasn't possible, but it was there, growing on the wall, a dark, silent echo of something wrong. I glanced at the occupancy counter again. 3. Still 3. But the air in the shed felt heavier, thicker, as if something else was present, something unseen. I grabbed my toolbox and hurried out of the shed, leaving the growing darkness behind. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see what it would become. As I walked back towards the signal box, I knew, with a chilling certainty, that accepting Greta's shift swap had been a mistake I wouldn't be able to undo. And I knew, with an even deeper dread, that the 27th of the month was going to be a very long night. I could feel it in the metallic tang on my tongue. I could feel it in the way the wind seemed to whisper around the corners of the building. I had done everything right, followed the procedure, and yet the feeling of wrongness had only intensified. The rules hadn't protected me. They had simply defined the terms of my imprisonment. The paperwork was the worst part. Always. Especially on a night like this. Endless manifests, track numbers, car assignments, all of it done by hand, then duplicated, then filed. I was sorting through the incoming freight list, trying to reconcile it with the rail yard's estimated arrival times when I noticed the chipped formica on my desk. It wasn't a new chip. I'd seen it for months, but tonight it seemed sharper, more defined, like a tiny white fracture in the otherwise monotonous gray. I traced it with my finger, a pointless gesture. Honestly, I was just trying to avoid thinking about the wall, about that impression. I kept replaying it in my head, trying to find a logical explanation. A trick of the light, maybe? A weird condensation pattern? But the smell, the iron smell that didn't have a logical explanation. I'd been working these rails for 15 years, and I'd never smelled anything like it. It clung to the back of my throat, a coppery taste I couldn't shake. I reached for my water bottle, hoping to wash it away, but it didn't help. The manifest I was working on concerned deliveries to the west siding, mostly lumber and steel for the construction site on the outskirts of town. I needed to verify the car numbers against the inbound train schedule. To do that, I had to walk down the west corridor, check the track diagrams posted on the bulletin board, and then return. It was a routine I'd done hundreds of times. A 5-minute walk, at most. As I stood up, I remembered the document, the one I'd skimmed during my initial training, the one full of peculiarities. I'd mostly dismissed it as bureaucratic overreach, the kind of thing someone makes up to feel important. But one section had stuck with me, something about corners, something about acknowledging them. It wasn't a clear rule, more of a suggestion, phrased in that archaic, overly formal language they used. Prior to navigating any internal corner, a percussive acknowledgement is advised. Percussive acknowledgement. Knocking. It sounded ridiculous. But the west corridor had a lot of corners. Narrow, abrupt turns where you couldn't see what was around the bend until you were practically on top of it. I hesitated. It felt silly, knocking on a wall, like something a child would do. I told myself it was just superstition, left over from whoever wrote that ridiculous document. I had a job to do, a schedule to maintain, and a mortgage to pay. I didn't have time for wall knocking. I started walking fast. I told myself I was just getting it over with, maximizing my efficiency. I rounded the first corner, a sharp 90-degree turn near the break room, without even slowing down. And that's when I saw it. Standing in the middle of the corridor, bathed in the sickly yellow glow of the emergency exit sign, was a figure. Tall, slender, and completely still. It wasn't wearing a uniform. It wasn't anyone I recognized. It wasn't even shaped like anyone I recognized. The form was slightly stretched, elongated, like a photograph left in the sun too long. I froze. My breath hitched in my throat. My skin prickled. It felt like every nerve ending was screaming. I didn't dare move. I didn't dare breathe. The figure hadn't moved. It hadn't acknowledged my presence. It just stood there. I didn't make eye contact, didn't even allow my gaze to linger. I turned, pivoted on my heel, and started walking back the way I came, moving as quickly as I dared without running. I rounded the corner, nearly colliding with the water cooler in the break room. I stopped, my chest heaving, and leaned against the cool metal. The figure hadn't followed me. I checked the occupancy counter. Still 3. I forced myself to take a deep breath, trying to calm my racing pulse. I had to get back to my desk, back to the manifests, back to anything that felt remotely normal. I noticed the bulletin board, the one with the track diagrams, and beside it a small metal plate, a speaker grill. I hadn't noticed it before. It was old, corroded, and covered in dust, but it was there, and it was connected to a wire that disappeared into the wall. I walked closer, examining it more closely. I ran my finger across the rusted metal, and then I heard it, a faint, static crackle, followed by a voice, a distorted, garbled voice. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was chilling. It sounded like an announcement. I didn't understand. I turned and walked back to my desk, ignoring the corners, ignoring the possibility that there were more things waiting around them. I sat down, my hands trembling, and stared at the stack of manifests. I needed to focus. I needed to get the work done, but the smell of iron lingered in my nostrils, and the image of that stretched, silent figure burned behind my eyelids. I picked up my pen and noticed that I had a slight tremor. It wasn't the kind of tremor that came from exhaustion. It was different, more internal. It resonated deep in my bones. I looked at the chipped formica on my desk again. The white fracture seemed wider now, more pronounced. I had a feeling I wasn't alone. And I had a feeling, a growing, sickening certainty, that this night was far from over. The manifests were mostly for lumber, heading up to Vance's mill. A few flatbeds with machinery, a couple of tankers full of propane. Nothing unusual. It was comforting. Repetitive. I liked repetitive. I needed repetitive. I took a sip of the coffee, lukewarm now, and scanned the next manifest. 3 boxcars of auto parts. Destination Kenji's Depot in Haddington. I needed to confirm the car numbers, cross-reference them with the yard map. It was tedious, but it was a task, a concrete thing to focus on. I started with the first car number, 8472. Found it on the map, then 8473 and 8474. I double-checked them, tracing the lines with my finger just to be sure. It was a habit ingrained from years of doing paperwork. I was about to move on to the next shipment when I realized I hadn't actually said the numbers aloud. I frowned. It was just easier to say them. Helps keep me on track. I started again, slowly, deliberately. 8472, 8473, 8474. It felt ridiculous, like talking to myself, but it worked. I got to 8475, then 8476. And then something felt off. I stopped, rereading the manifest. There were only 6 cars listed. 6, but I distinctly remembered saying 7 numbers. I tried to reconstruct it in my head. 84, 72, 73, 74, 75, 76. And then, what came after 76? I couldn't place it. I felt a prickle at the back of my neck, like static electricity, a glitch in my memory. I told myself it was exhaustion, the coffee, the general weirdness of the last few nights. Just my brain playing tricks on me. I glanced at the occupancy counter, still reading 3. That didn't help. It never helped. I started counting the cars on the manifest again, silently this time. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 cars. Definitely 6. I focused on the physical paper, the printed numbers, the weight of the clipboard in my hands. It had to be 6. I was just tired. I was letting things get to me. Ray had warned me about taking this job. She said I needed to rest. But what choice did I have? The bills weren't going to pay themselves, and the thought of explaining another medical bill shortfall to Mona. I reached for the phone to double-check the shipment details with dispatch, just to confirm. Just to be absolutely sure. The phone was on the shelf above the filing cabinet. I stretched, reaching up, and knocked over the stack of empty coffee cups I'd been meaning to rinse out. They clattered to the floor, ceramic against concrete. I sighed. Wonderful. As I bent to pick them up, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A small wooden crate, tucked away in the corner of the shelf, behind the phone. It wasn't addressed to anyone. It wasn't marked with any shipping information. It was just there. And it hadn't been there this morning. I was certain of it. I always made a mental note of anything new, anything out of place. I hesitated. I should probably just leave it. It wasn't my concern. But what if it was important? What if it contained something that needed to be logged? Something related to the shipments? I ignored the small voice that reminded me of the missed pickup from Mort's. Ignoring things hadn't worked out well. But I couldn't ask anyone about it, not out loud. I remembered something, a vague impression of something I read in that binder. Something about not soliciting information, not drawing attention to things, something about the repercussions. It wasn't precise, just a lingering sense of unease. I couldn't recall the exact wording. The crate was small enough that I could easily lift it down. But I couldn't say I was lifting it down. I couldn't even think the words "I'm lifting the crate." I tested it, silently mouthing the phrase. A wave of dizziness washed over me, and I stumbled back against the filing cabinet. Okay. No talking. No thinking about talking. I carefully reached for the crate, lifting it off the shelf. It was surprisingly heavy. I set it on the desk next to the manifests, and then I realized the manifest for the auto parts. Kenji's depot. It wasn't 6 cars. It was 7. The last car number was 8477. I knew it now, but I hadn't counted it. I hadn't said it, and the number hadn't been there before. I hadn't imagined it. It had appeared after I stopped counting aloud. I stared at the manifest, a cold dread settling in my stomach. The crate sat on the desk, silently accusing. I had a job to do. I needed to log the discrepancy, alert dispatch. But I couldn't even form the sentence in my head. Not without something happening. Something bad. I stared at the crate and the blank space where the 7th car should have been on the yard map. And I knew, with a sickening certainty, that I wouldn't be logging anything tonight. Not about the crate, not about the missing car, not about anything at all. The drive home was gray. It wasn't raining, but the kind of damp that settles into your bones. I hadn't slept, not really. I just dozed in the chair between checking the manifests, staring at that crate. I hadn't touched it again. I didn't even look at it after I noticed the extra car number. I just waited for the shift to end. Ray was already up, making coffee. She didn't ask how it went. She rarely did. She knew the shifts were rough. She knew the pay was good, and she knew better than to pry. She just handed me a mug, black, the way I liked it. It was a chipped ceramic one, floral. It was one of the few we hadn't gotten rid of after the hospital bills started piling up. I didn't say thank you, I just took it. I tried to explain it to her later, about the car number, about the crate, about the feeling. It came out wrong, of course. It sounded like I was complaining, like I was looking for sympathy. I kept saying it was probably just a mistake, a misprint, a glitch in the system, that I was tired, stressed, that I was letting things get to me. She listened, nodding occasionally, stirring sugar into her tea. It didn't help. It never did. But she didn't tell me I was being ridiculous. I appreciated that. The first few days were the worst. I kept seeing corners everywhere. In the hallway, in the grocery store, even in the living room. I'd find myself instinctively angling my body, avoiding them, not consciously at first, just a slight shift in direction, a tightening in my shoulders. It felt stupid. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I needed to relax. But the impulse didn't go away. I quit listening to podcasts during my shifts. I couldn't concentrate. Every voice sounded wrong, like they were saying something else, something hidden beneath the words. I started just sitting there, in silence, staring at the tracks, counting the ties, trying not to think about the crate, about the 7th car. The medical bills didn't stop. They rarely do. But the new shift schedule came out, and my coverage was consistent. Enough to keep us afloat, enough to keep the house. I kept going back each time. The dread felt a little less sharp, a little more familiar. It's been almost a year now. I still work the overnight switch. I don't take shift swaps. I avoid yellow. And I never ever count out loud. Not even to myself. We tried to go back to the farmer's market last weekend. It was a nice day. The sun was shining, people were milling about. We used to go every Saturday, but the layout had changed. They'd added a new row of vendors, creating a sharp right angle near the fruit stand. I stopped dead in my tracks. My throat constricted. A wave of nausea washed over me. I couldn't explain it to Ray. Not really. I just said I wasn't feeling well. We turned around and went home. Now, I walk the long way to the grocery store, 2 extra blocks, but it avoids that corner. It adds 15 minutes to my commute. It feels necessary. I don't even think about it anymore. It just is. Yesterday, I saw the notice posted at the station. Another opening for the overnight switch operator. The requirements were the same. The pay was the same. Everything was the same. Below it, someone had scrawled a single word in faded black marker: apply.